My name is Owen Neumayer.
My name is Logan Davis.
We are students here at the University of Kentucky, and for our final project in the History 323, the Holocaust course, we have decided to study one of the largest Nazi concentration camps, Sobibor. This Eastern Polish camp was the site of roughly 250,000 victims of the Holocaust. By studying this camp and the stories from its survivors, we pay homage not only to the martyrs and fighters of Sobibor, but to all those who experienced the Nazi infernos.
By studying Sobibor, we can learn more about the National Socialist war machine and their motives towards their undesirables, like Jews, Roma, Gypsies, homosexuals, and more. The Sobibor prisoner revolt of October 1943 serves as an example of Jewish resistance and can also tell us more about the strength and resilience of the Jews during this time. We have multiple rhetorical research questions, which we will be aiming to answer from our studies and through this project.
What were the key factors that enabled the Sobibor uprising to take place? What does it reveal about resistance in Nazi extermination camps? And lastly, was the revolt due to Nazi overconfidence or the strength of the prisoners in the camps? By using primary sources such as Sobibor, Martyrdom, and Revolt, the Hoffel Telegram, and multiple other first-hand accounts of the Sobibor experience, we can answer these questions and dive into the effects that this extermination camp left. We will also be using multiple peer-reviewed articles and journals to determine everything that went into the construction of the camp and the eventual uprising. We hope you enjoy learning about this meaningful feat of Jewish resistance, and we would also like to preface this presentation by noting that there are very few original photos of the Sobibor extermination camp.
The fall of 1941 marked the creation of a German Nazi government department named Operation Reinhard. This department established and constructed three of the deadliest Nazi extermination camps and killing centers: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Germany in the late 1930s and early 1940s had been reverting to a euthanasia program to kill populations of people who were deemed undesirables by their regime. The establishment of these large concentration camp killing centers through Operation Reinhard signified an expansion of mass killings and the institutionalizing of these sadistic practices. An example of how organized and efficient the Nazis made Operation Reinhard can be seen in the Hoffel Telegram, dating back to 1942, which details deportations of Jews and their arrival at certain camps.
The same personnel who organized the Nazi euthanasia programs were involved with the construction of the Sobibor extermination camp. High-ranking Nazi officials like Himmler and Hitler themselves discussed the necessity for such camps in late 1941 at the Wolf's entrenchment, and their decisions directly correlated with the actions of people in charge of Sobibor's operations like Odilo Globocnik. The construction of the gas chambers and camp quarters themselves began in spring of 1942 and was initially completed under Christian Worth. The gas chambers themselves were part of Subcamp Number 3 at Sobibor and were constructed under the direction of Erwin Lambert. The gas chambers he constructed were supposed to appear as showers so prisoners could disinfect themselves as they arrived to the camp.
Multiple testimonies detail subcamp number 3 as a place where nobody returned from. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, a belt of mines, and a ditch filled with water, and was the only death camp that was surrounded by mines.
Subcamp or Lager Number 1 included prisoner barracks and kitchens. Subcamp Number 2 included the unclothing areas with places for prisoners' belongings to be stored. And Subcamp Number 3 included 5 gas chambers, which could hold 80 people each at its capacity. These large gas chambers were the main reason that Sobibor was able to exterminate so many people in under 2 years of operation. It was rare for prisoners at this camp to work at subcamps or surrounding factories, as very few workers that were deemed fit were allowed to remain at the camp for an extended period of time. Sobibor truly was more for death than it was for work. It differed from Auschwitz in this manner, as less than 10% of prisoners were left alive to work at Sobibor. This tells us a great deal about the Nazi death camps and how horrific the conditions were.
As we have mentioned, Sobibor is located in eastern Poland. As we know from our studies in this past semester, Jews from Poland, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia were the first Jews to be deported and killed. This remains true for the first victims of Sobibor death camp, as some of its early victims were deported for extermination from these other European countries. In May of 1942, a transport of Jewish and other undesirable victims were sent to Sobibor. This is believed to be the first of its kind to Sobibor, and this is when the killing began there. A typical transport in this fashion included 40 to 50 freight cars, quote, with 100 Jews packed into one wagon, end quote. Because of the heavy forest surrounding Sobibor, many victims were under the belief that they were simply at a labor camp. They had heard tales of extermination in Belzec, but were unsure if it could be true for them at Sobibor. A survivor of Sobibor, Burr Freeberg, even said, quote, "The death factory at Sobibor looked like a big farm where everything appeared normal," end quote.
As we will later go further into, there was indeed an uprising by prisoners at Sobibor death camp in October of 1943. The uprising was led by Soviet POWs who arrived in Sobibor in September of 1943. Many Polish Jews were able to survive in the camp by learning a routine and supporting each other whenever possible. By the time September 1943 came, Soviet prisoners of war had arrived, and this marked the first time that many of the Sobibor prisoners had seen the enemies of the German war machine. In Sobibor, Martyrdom and Revolt by Miriam Novich, which we have referenced countless times for this project, multiple survivors mark the fall of 1943 as the origin of legitimate plans for escape.
The arrival of the POWs was a turning point, as Burr Freeberg notes in her testimony from Sobibor, Martyrdom, and Revolt, saying, quote, "Polish Jews knew the camps and SS habits. The Russians knew how to use arms," end quote. Among these Polish Jews and Soviet POWs were craftsmen, such as shoemakers and jewelers, and other undesirables of the German Reich, such as gypsies. In the 16 months that Sobibor was operational, it is estimated by Miriam Novich that 250,000 people were killed at the camp. Other sources estimate the toll to be much greater than 250,000 victims.
After Sobibor was built in 1942, the Nazis expected it to be one of their most prominent extermination camps simply due to the railway. It was stationed next to the camp and was an efficient transporter to get Jews in as quickly as possible. Due to this, there was transportations from a total of 6 countries: Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, France, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia.
In the Netherlands, there were two primary camps. They were Westerbork and Vught. The primary usage of the Vught camp was to hold prisoners until they could be transported to Westerbork. Once at Westerbork, the Germans carried out the operation to transport them to Sobibor for good. Quote, "Over the period from the 2nd of March to the 8th of June in 1943, 15 trains, i.e., one train per week, left for Sobibor. However, after the 8th of June, there was a 2-week break that lasted until the 29th of June, during which no transports were sent from Westerbork. After that, there were 4 more transports, the last leaving on 20th of July, 1943. To sum up, altogether, there were 19 transports from the Netherlands, which carried a total of 34,313 Jews to their deaths," end quote.
In France, the majority of the Jews were transported from Vichy. There were 4 total transports to Sobibor, and the splits were as follows: 1,024 Jews, 770 Jews, roughly 1,000 Jews, and again, roughly 1,000 Jews. This added up to about 3,794 Jews from France that were sent to Sobibor.
In Austria and Germany, there were trains taking Jews to the concentration camps Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor after the Wannsee Conference. Quote, "Eichmann's office issued a directive to no longer send deportation trains from the Third Reich to Minsk or Riga, but rather to send these straight to the ghettos and camps in the Lublin district," end quote. There were 10 total trains sent to Sobibor via Belzec, each filled with 1,000 people. Among the Jews that were carried on these transports, 7,000 were killed at Sobibor. Bem states that the total number of Sobibor victims coming from Austria and Germany amounted to 23,500 Jews.
Following the Munich Conference Agreement, the Germans divided Czechoslovakia in 2 separate states: the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and the Slovak state. In November of 1941, the Germans commenced the deportation of 74,000 Jews from the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia to the ghetto in Terezin. On May 19th, 1942, a transport from Terezin ran to Lublin. The first train dropped off 1,000 Jews at Boranowitz, excuse me. Later, all 1,000 ended up at Sobibor. Transports similar to this continued to run from Terezin until all of these camps in Lublin folded. Merrick Bem states that historian Peter Witt believes that 28,284 Jews between the 2 states were deported to Sobibor.
Quote, "When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the formerly independent nations of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as well as the western part of Belarus, together with Minsk, were incorporated into Reichskommissariat Ostland, or Reich Commissary for the East. Following this, between 1941 and 1942, the Einsatzgruppen murdered the majority of the Jews in those territories. By June 1943, the surviving Jewish population was around 72,000 and were concentrated mostly in the ghettos of 6 cities: Vilnius, Kovno, Swazle, Riga, Minsk, and Lida," end quote. In total, at least 15,000 Jews from these ghettos were sent to Sobibor. Of those 15,000, Bem states that an estimated 13,000 were killed within the gas chambers.
The total number of Jews killed at Sobibor is heavily disputed among historians. Bem gives a list of 7 institutions or historians that have estimates on the number of casualties at the camp. The numbers range from 130,000 to 600,000. While we may never know the exact number, it is ballparked at about 250,000. That is the most common number stated between scholarly and non-scholarly sources. This ranks it as the fourth most deadly extermination camp behind Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Belzec. As Sobibor survivor Ilana Safran put it, Sobibor was hell. Many prisoners shared the same experience. Alexander Pechersky, one of the leaders of revolt, said, quote, "On our first day of work, 15 people got 25 lashes each for incompetence." Pechersky also spoke about his arrival at the camp by saying it, quote, "made a great impression on the older prisoners. We were approached by men and women who made us understand that their wish was to get out of hell," end quote. Survivor Herschel Zuckerman tells readers that her life was changed due to the horrible conditions of Sobibor, finishing her testimony with the words, quote, "To survive Sobibor does not mean living," end quote. We use these quotes to illustrate the attitude and sentiment from the survivors of the Sobibor extermination camp. Just as in all the other camps, prisoners felt a longing for freedom and the return to their homes.
In September of 1943, there was a committee formed between prisoners of the camp led by Leon Fellhendler and Alexander Pechersky. Pechersky quickly learned that the topography of Sobibor and the habits of camp guards, saying, quote, "One week after I arrived at the camp, I know everything about the hell of Sobibor," end quote. Fellhendler and Pechersky organized a committee of 10 men who would then coordinate escape and uprising plans with 6 other people, meaning 60 people would be aware of the escape multiple days in advance. The rest of the prisoners would be informed of the escape the day that it was set to happen.
The revolt was scheduled for October 14th, 1943 at 4 p.m. On the night of October 13th, 1943, Sasha Pechersky and Leon Fellhendler handed out knives, hatchets, and warm clothes. The plan was for 5 men to isolate SS and German personnel starting at 4 p.m. after phone lines were cut at Camp Number 2. Thomas Blatt was a Sobibor survivor, and was part of a larger auxiliary force that revolted at Sobibor. He remembers being nervous about the beginning of the uprising, saying, quote, "I waited anxiously at camp for the men to come and kill the Nazis," end quote. SS officers were invited into different workshops from 4 to 4:45 p.m. on October 14th, 1943, and from 4:44 to 4:45 on that day. 17 SS and Ukrainian auxiliary soldiers were murdered with knives, hatchets, and axes by Jewish prisoners and Soviet POWs at Sobibor.
After these men were systematically murdered one by one prisoner sounded the roll call whistle, and all of the prisoners, including those who were not cued in on the revolt initially, left their barracks at once. This was the moment when 600 prisoners rushed from the gates of Sobibor, with the brave few of them taking up German arms against the remaining SS and Ukrainian guards. Of the 600 prisoners who tried to escape, it is estimated that around 300 of them survived the initial escape. In all of the testimonies we have analyzed, this was a pivotal moment for the Jewish and Russian POW survivors. As a crowd of rebels let out a loud hurrah, and as prisoners shouted, "Forward, forward," to one another. These survivors then escaped to the forest. Some of them were fortunate enough to join partisan groups, while others succumbed to the elements of the Polish forest.
Victims of the Holocaust tried to resist their systematic oppression in many different ways, but it was rare to see such a successful and complex armed revolt such as this one. The story of the revolt at Sobibor in October of 1943 speaks volumes about the victims who were present at the camp and about all Holocaust victims. This story debunks the myth that Jews never rebelled and were simply sheep to the slaughter.
Alexander Pechersky's role in the Sobibor uprising of October 14th, 1943 was both pivotal and symbolic. Though not the sole architect of the revolt, Pechersky emerged as its undisputed leader. He was a figure whose military background, personal resilience, and charisma made the uprising possible. His story, though often obscured or politically manipulated in the years following the war, represents the courage, tragedy, and forgotten resistance within a larger narrative of the Holocaust.
Pechersky was a Soviet Jewish officer captured by the Nazis during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. He was born in 1909 in Kremenchuk and raised in Rostov. He was an educated man, deeply interested in literature, theater, and music. This cultural background, coupled with his military training, made him uniquely suited to lead under extreme circumstances. His arrival in Sobibor in 1943, along with a group of approximately 80 other Soviet POWs, marked a turning point. These men were not like the other prisoners. They were trained, disciplined, and capable of coordinated action. More importantly, they maintained a psychological fortitude that impressed and inspired the longer-term inmates of the camp.
Though the initial groundwork for resistance had been laid by Polish Jews like Leon Feldhendler, and it was Pechersky who unified the various efforts into a coherent plan. His leadership transcended linguistic and cultural barriers as he quickly earned the respect of others through his calm authority and sense of purpose. In his own words, Pechersky wrote that despite SS attempts to break their spirits through psychological torment and physical terror, quote, they failed to rob us of our humanity, end quote. This unyielding courage became the emotional foundation of the uprising.
The revolt itself was meticulously planned and executed under Pechersky's guidance. The goal was twofold: to kill as many SS officers as possible and to enable a mass escape. The symbolic success of the rebellion was immense. Sobibor was soon dismantled by the Nazis, its existence buried in an attempt to erase the memory of the revolt. The very act of organized resistance within a death camp challenged the common misconception that Jews went passively to their deaths.
After the war, Pechersky's story became entangled in the politics of post-war Soviet Union. Quote, but instead of recognition after the war, he was first regarded as a traitor and once home became a victim of Stalinist anti-Semitism at its peak. End quote. He kept asking people for help, but no one could truly help him.
He lost his job, lived in poverty, and was barred from testifying at international trials like Nuremberg or the Eichmann proceedings. His life, marked by courage during the war, was followed by repression and neglect in peacetime. Despite this, Pechersky never ceased trying to share his story, writing letters and memoirs, many of which were censored or revised to fit political narratives.
Pechersky's role in the Sobibor uprising reveals much about the forgotten dimensions of Holocaust resistance. His story undermines the myth of passive victimhood and instead highlights the complex reality of defiance, especially in the East, where Soviet and Jewish identities often overlapped, but were later politically suppressed. He was not the blonde hero of Western film adaptations, but a real man of great strength, moral clarity, and immense bravery. As seen in Richard Carter White's Towards a Spatial Historiography of the Holocaust, Resistance film, and the prisoner uprising at Sobibor death camp, there was extensive plans for escapes from Sobibor. Certain group of prisoners had to be coerced by Sasa Pechersky and Leon Feldhendler to wait to escape until there was a large plan in place by Sasha and Leon's committee. There were even plans for prisoners to dig tunnels under a fence in a certain area of the camp, which was not surrounded completely by mines. This plan, among others, was delayed until the large prisoner uprising of October 14th.
It is clear that SS and Ukrainian auxiliary forces had a tight grip on this camp. Nazis used a strict routine and terroristic punishment systems to keep the prisoners on their toes. Just 2 months before the revolt at Sobibor, there was a similar revolt at Treblinka in which 300 Jews escaped. One could confidently assume that the Germans and Ukrainians were mindful that a riot or revolt was a possibility.
The arrival of Soviet POWs in September of 1943 was the final missing piece for those who wanted to revolt. As previously mentioned, people like Jewish Poles who knew the area could be very useful to people like Soviet POWs who knew how to use the weapons. One of the final factors worth noting in the uprising was the absence of SS leader Hubert Gomersky.
Sasha Pechersky describes him in Miriam Novich's Sobibor Martyrdom and Revolt as, quote, on October 14th, Gomersky was on vacation. The Lagerführer Frenzel was a bastard, but compared to Gomersky, he seemed a choir boy, end quote. For the sake of this project and based on our research, we can reasonably infer that it was a mixture of the bravery and organization of the prisoners of Sobibor and the ignorance of SS personnel to be lured into separated spaces with the prisoners, allowing the uprising to take place. Obviously, this uprising not only marked one of the most significant acts of Jewish resistance during World War II, but also exposed the cracks in the Nazis' regime's genocidal process. Through a detailed examination of the revolt, it becomes clear that while the camps were designed to function as efficient systems of murder, they were also places of human defiance and resilience.
The Nazi extermination camps, including Sobibor, were established with clinical precision to carry out mass murder on an industrial scale. Quote, the extermination mechanism was designed by specifically appointed task force, the so-called relocation staff, end quote. This quote underlines the deliberate planning and bureaucratic efficiency that underscored the Holocaust. Sobibor, like other camps under Operation Reinhardt, was purpose-built in an isolated area and designed with sectors that enabled the swift extermination of Jews. Everything from unloading ramps to gas chambers was part of an engineered process of annihilation.
However, the Sobibor uprising also reveals that resistance was always a possibility, despite the extreme conditions and constant threat of death. The revolt was not a spontaneous act, but the result of careful planning and cooperation among various groups within the camp. The camp resistance movement, supported by the former Soviet troopers who knew how to use the weapons, made the idea of revolt more and more realistic. This quote illustrates the turning point where hope began to grow within the camp. The arrival of Soviet POWs brought military knowledge and leadership to an already building resistance, proving that even within the heart of the Nazi death machine, organized resistance could emerge.
Moreover, the Nazis' response to the revolt demonstrates how seriously they regarded the threat of resistance. In the aftermath of the uprising, the article notes that, quote, it was necessary to use arms when searching the camp because the prisoners resisted, end quote. This admission not only confirms the scale of the resistance, but also suggests the courage of the prisoners who chose to fight back. The use of the word Aufstand or uprising in official German reports emphasizes the magnitude of the event from the Nazis' perspective.
It was more than an escape. It was a blow to the perceived invincibility of their system. Nazi extermination camps, though designed for absolute control and destruction, were not immune to resistance. The revolt shattered the illusion of total Nazi dominance and demonstrated the enduring power of human will and solidarity in the face of atrocity. Through careful planning, courage, and sacrifice, the prisoners of Sobibor turned a place of death into a symbol of defiance.
The story of Sobibor is more than the history of a single Nazi death camp. It serves as a microcosm of Jewish resistance in the Holocaust as a whole. Through stories from Sobibor martyrdom and revolt and testimonies like Thomas Blatt's interview, we see the direct impact the camp had on its victims. Within its barbed wire boundaries lay the fullness of the Holocaust horrors: industrialized murder, dehumanization, forced labor, deception, and ultimately resistance. Sobibor was both a symbol of Nazi efficiency and a genocide, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of brutality. By examining Sobibor, we gained insight into the broader system of extermination that claimed millions of Jews' lives across Nazi occupied Europe.
Sobibor's very existence illustrates the organized, systematic nature of the Holocaust. Like the camps at Treblinka and Belzec, Sobibor was constructed specifically for the purpose of mass murder under Operation Reinhardt. The camp was set up in a densely forested area by a railroad line, deliberately hidden from the public eye. The Nazis used words like relocation to deceive their victims and constructed the camp near railway lines to maximize efficiency in transporting Jews from across Europe to their deaths. This logistical precision reflects the chilling rationality with which the Nazi regime approached genocide. Murder was not random, but systematic.
The operations inside Sobibor reveal the total dehumanization and exploitation that characterized the Holocaust. Upon arrival, most prisoners were sent directly to gas chambers, while a small number were temporarily spared to serve the camp's operation. They were employed in the workshop, did some cleaning works, extended the camp, segregated the victims' property, unloaded transports. These forced laborers were reduced to tools of the extermination process, cleaning, building, sorting the possessions of the dead until they too were killed. This reflects the broader Nazi view of Jews as subhuman and disposable, a view that underpinned every phase of the Holocaust.
Yet, even in a place designed to crush the soul, there obviously was defiance and resistance. Through Pechersky's lead, the revolt was a calculated collective effort to reclaim agency in the face of annihilation. Though most of the escapees were recaptured and murdered, the act itself was profoundly meaningful. It demonstrated that even in the most hopeless conditions, people still found ways to fight back. The Nazis' reaction to the revolt, destroying the camp and murdering its remaining prisoners, underscores their desperate desire to erase both victims and evidence. Just as at other extermination sites, the goal was not just mass murder, but the obliteration of memory.
The camp's legacy now stands as powerful counter to the Nazi attempt to silence their victims. Civil War encapsulates the Holocaust core elements: the bureaucracy of genocide, the depths of cruelty, and the flickers of resistance. It shows us how the Holocaust was not only a campaign of murder, but one of erasure of people, families, cultures, and even historical truth. And yet, within that darkness, stories like Sobibor's uprising reveal the strength of those who refuse to go quietly. In remembering Sobibor, we remember not only how Jews died during the Holocaust, but how some fought, resisted, and survived.
As previously mentioned, roughly 300 of the 600 rebels survived the initial uprising and escaped. Most of these survivors were split into small groups as they traversed the forests of eastern Poland in search for food and hiding places. Sasha Pechersky and multiple other conspirators of the uprising remained in a group of 57 prisoners for about 13 kilometers until they deemed it an appropriate time to split up to remain hidden. The group hid during the day and walked eastward at night, scavenging for food and supplies along the way. 8 days after the initial uprising of October 14th, a group including Sasha and six others crossed a river they deemed as the Bug and joined a unit of partisans of the Voroshilov detachment. This was the beginning of a new story for these young men.
Other survivors of the uprising were not so lucky to find an escape from the elements as fast as Sasha and his group did. Survivor Kurt Thomas describes his life as he wandered for a month in the forest until November 1943, when, quote, a peasant allowed me to hide in his pigsty. I remained there until July 1944. For 9 months, I remained in a crouching position and could see the sky only from a hole in the roof, end quote.
We included two of these survivor testimonies to display the different experiences of survivors after their escape, as their life was forever altered by these experiences. These two insane stories of survival and resistance serve as a reminder of the stories which will forever be lost to history due to the Nazi killing machine. This quote, included in an early part of this presentation, describes the effects of experiences perfectly, stating, quote, to survive Sobibor does not mean living, end quote.
The end of Sobibor marked not only the closure of one of the most notorious Nazi extermination camps, but also a significant turning point in the Holocaust and its legacy. After operating for just over a year, the camp shut down in late 1943. Though the camp itself ceased to function, its impact continued to reverberate, both in the immediate Nazi response and in the broader historical memory of the Holocaust.
The uprising was the clear catalyst for the camp's closure. As previously mentioned, of the 300 prisoners that fled, only about 50 survived the war. In response to this revolt, Heinrich Himmler ordered the immediate liquidation of the Sobibor camp. All remaining prisoners were executed. A special unit of Jewish laborers from Treblinka was brought in to dismantle the camp, destroy the evidence, and cover up the traces of mass murder. Once their work was complete, they too were executed.
The camp area was leveled, trees were planted, and a farmhouse was built over the site to erase its existence. This was consistent with Nazi efforts across other Operation Reinhardt camps to leave no evidence behind and to prevent future generations from uncovering the full scale of the genocide.
However, the effects of Sobibor's resistance and its violent end could not be completely erased. In the short term, the revolt and the camp's closure triggered a broader wave of Nazi reprisals. One of the most direct consequences was Action Erntefest, or Operation Harvest Festival, during which approximately 42,000 Jews were massacred in Majdanek, Trzewinki, and Poniatowa on the 3rd and 4th of November in 1943. Himmler, fearing further uprisings, ordered these mass killings as a preemptive strike to eliminate the possibility of additional resistance. In this sense, the legacy of Sobibor's revolt was a paradox. It was a moment of resistance that inspired fear in the Nazis, but also led to further atrocities.
In the long term, Sobibor became a symbol of both the horrors of the Holocaust and the resilience of its victims. The testimonies of the few survivors helped to reconstruct the history of the camp and ensure that its story would not be forgotten. The uprising remains one of the most remarkable acts of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, standing alongside the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the Treblinka Revolt. It has been the subject of films, books, and scholarly research, all of which keep alive the memory of those who suffered and those who fought back. The physical site of Sobibor is now a place of remembrance, with a museum and memorial that honors the victims. Archaeological excavations in recent years have uncovered parts of the camp that were once thought lost forever, such as the foundations of gas chambers and personal belongings of the murdered. These discoveries continue to challenge denial and reinforce the historical truth of what occurred there.
The end of Sobibor was not the end of its story. Though the Nazis tried to bury it, literally and figuratively, the camp's legacy endured. It lived on through the voices of survivors, the impact of its revolt, and the ongoing efforts to preserve memory and confront the atrocities of the Holocaust. Sobibor stands as both a site of unspeakable horror and a testament to the human capacity for resistance in even the darkest moments of history.
Our study of Sobibor and the resistance movement led by prisoners of the death camp tell not only an inspiring story of Jewish pride, but it also serves as a reminder of how Holocaust history should be studied. Studying this story allows us to remember and respect those who lost their lives in these awful conditions.
By studying the conditions of the camp and answering why and how the revolt happened, we can remember everyone who is a victim of Germany's tyranny in Sobibor and elsewhere. As Miriam Novich said, we pay homage not only to the martyrs and fighters of Sobibor, but to all of those who experienced the Nazi infernos.
Many survivors of Sobibor went on to return home to their original birthplace after the end of the war. Some traveled to the new state of Israel, and others made it to America.
It is unknown exactly how many people survived the Sobibor camp uprising. The existence of the survivors remind us of the brave Jewish resistance movements which took place throughout the Holocaust and many killing fields of Eastern Europe. Their story serves as a reminder of the millions who lost their lives and whose story is lost as well. It is our duty to learn from this history, because as the famous quote goes, those who cannot learn from history are forever doomed to repeat it.
Thank you for watching.